Was Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, defeated by the Moabite deity Chemosh? And did the authors and redactors of Kings know this, admit this, and subtly cover it up within 2 Kings chapter 3? And while an initial reading does seem to support the notion that Yahweh lost, the information in this video is going to completely alter how you view Israel's defeat within this passage. And I'll provide a very short overview. This story seems fairly straightforward, and for that reason, it is very problematic. God promises the Israelites a defeat over the Moabites, even calling this, quote, a light thing in the sight of Yahweh. By the way, remember that verse. It's important, and we're coming back to it later. And just when Israel has the final city surrounded, with Mesha, the king of Moab, inside, this Moabite king offers his son and future heir as a burnt offering on the city wall. And then a great wrath falls upon the Israelites, and they withdraw from the city and they return home. And thus, it appears that God's words through the prophet Elisha do not come to pass. Now, a popular explanation for this is that the biblical author is having to navigate a very difficult and problematic event in the career of the prophet Elijah, where Elisha seemingly prophesies wrong, or Yahweh simply loses this battle. But in the end, the author seems to admit this, although he appears to greatly downplay the significance of this event. And some have linked what is known as the Mesha Inscription, in which the king Mesha, from this story in 2 Kings, credits his patron deity Chemosh with driving the Israelites away. And ultimately, this is what is viewed as the Great Wrath from 2 Kings 3:27. However, there are two potential reasons that this Great Wrath is actually God placing judgment on Israel, and specifically Israel's king. And these two reasons involve examining this passage in a broader context, namely the literary structure of the passage, as well as parallels existing between this passage and earlier passages within 1 Kings. Now, beginning with the literary structure, we see something very unique within the fulfillment of Elisha's prophecy, and that is that it does not follow the standard prophecy fulfillment pattern, in which a narrator records events in a parallel pattern. Here in 2 Kings, we actually see the narrator reporting the fulfillment of Elisha's words in reverse order, as a chiasm or within chiastic structure. And this reverse order of events sets the reader up for a surprise. And furthermore, in verse 24, which is the verse immediately preceding the fulfillment of the prophecy, the narrator uses the Hebrew word nikah 3 times to describe how the Israelites had attacked, struck, and were destroying Moab. However, in verse 25, the narrator suddenly changes the word from nikah to haras when describing Israel overthrowing. And this change implies that Israel's king Jehoram will not be victorious. But this change is going to be easily missed, especially by readers in English or any language aside from Hebrew. And even in Hebrew, the change is so subtle that the reader might not be picking up on what the author is leading toward. And at this point, the reader is likely under the impression that the author is building up for a word-for-word fulfillment of the prophecy. That is until they are met with a surprise at the very end of verse 25. When the final city seems to almost be taken, it is only the slingers that surround and strike, or nikah, the city. And this is ultimately building toward the idea that Israel and King Jehoram will in fact not be victorious, but rather that the prophecy given to Elisha was intentionally deceptive. And to examine that, we have to go back to 1 Kings chapter 22, where this same type of deceptive prophecy and enticing occurred. And this is the story of King Ahab's defeat. What makes this story relevant to the prophecy of Elisha is that King Ahab's defeat and ultimately death come at the hand of a prophecy from the prophet Micaiah that does not materialize. And to provide additional detail on this, Micaiah is called in to King Ahab. Micaiah tells him in 1 Kings 22 verse 15 that the Lord will give the victory. However, King Ahab is a little skeptical of this, and he calls Micaiah out. And Micaiah proceeds to tell Ahab of a divine council throne room scene in which it was decided that Ahab would be enticed to go out to battle in order to lose the battle. And this is what it says starting in verse 20. And the Lord said, "Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. And did you catch the last part of that? While it was a spirit that was to go out and entice the prophets of Ahab, it was the Lord who received credit for the enticing. And it was also the Lord that declared disaster for King Ahab. But there are other similarities between these passages as well. And these are Elisha's promise of triumph in 2 Kings 3:18 mirrors almost exactly Micaiah's original prophecy of victory in 1 Kings 22:15. And in both stories, Jehoshaphat accompanies a king of Israel into battle. And sticking with Jehoshaphat, in 2 Kings 3, he twice quotes himself from the narrative in 1 Kings chapter 22. And these similarities, along with other textual features, seem to indicate that the enticing and deceptive prophecy in 1 Kings chapter 22 is the reading lens for Elisha's so-called failed prophecy in 2 Kings chapter 3. In other words, just as the prophets of Ahab, inspired by lying spirits, and initially Micaiah, gave an enticing word of victory for Ahab, so Elisha is enticing Jehoram to his defeat by Mesha of Moab. And for readers familiar with Ahab's lineage, these parallels create the expectation of judgment to be passed on King Jehoram. And this is because back in 1 Kings 21:29, Yahweh has announced that Elijah's oracle of judgment would come to pass in the days of Ahab's son. And his son is Jehoram. Now, if you remember the verse from earlier in 2 Kings 3:18, where it stated, "This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand." This is where that verse comes full circle. And rather than this being one of the most problematic points of this story, in reality, it becomes one of the most compelling clues to indicate that Elisha's prophecy was intentionally deceptive and that Jehoram will not be handed a victory. And that is because the word in which we get the English translation light thing is the Hebrew word kilel. And this word was used one chapter prior, not to describe an easy thing, but to describe a curse on a group of young princes who were heckling Elisha. And if you're not familiar with this story, this is when the prophet Elisha is traveling to Bethel. And on the way, it says a group of small boys came out of the city and began heckling him, although small boys or boys really is not a good translation here at all, and that's why I referred to them as princes earlier. I'll link information in the description below. This group of individuals begins heckling Elijah, saying, "Go up, Baldy, go up, Baldy." And his response in 2 Kings 2:24 is that he cursed them. He kileled them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. Now, these 2 female bears tend to get all the attention in the story because of what they do. However, the link here is that this word kilel is used here to describe a curse. And in chapter 3, it is translated as, "This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord." And the linguistic connection here is that chapter 3 is drawing on this curse from chapter 2. And therefore, what we have is more evidence to support the idea that this was not going to be a victory for King Jehoram, but rather, in this instance, he's not only being enticed, it may also be that Elisha is cursing him just as he cursed these 42 individuals in chapter 2. And so what we have in this story is that Jehoram is enticed to defeat, just like his father Ahab. But unlike his father Ahab, he does not die because Yahweh is merciful, and his retribution is delayed, which is a theme throughout the book of Kings. However, this does not delay Elijah's oracle of judgment, and this comes in time with the death of Jehoram's son in 2 Kings chapter 9. And ultimately, perhaps the best explanation for this story is not that the biblical authors were trying to cover up Yahweh's defeat by Chemosh, but rather that this was Yahweh's will, that Jehoram would go to battle thinking he would be victorious, only not to receive the victory. And that the great wrath that fell upon Israel in the final verse of this passage was not the great wrath of Chemosh, but rather the great wrath of Yahweh. And we see further evidence of this with the noun ketsef, translated as wrath, occurring 28 times within the biblical text and usually referring to God's wrath or anger, with the exceptions being Ecclesiastes 5:16 and Esther 1:18. And within all 6 occurrences of the words ketsef and gadol, translated as great wrath, used within the biblical text, every single one of these instances refers to the great wrath of Yahweh. And therefore, within 2 Kings 3:27, it would make little sense why this would be the only instance in which this phrase does not refer to the divine wrath of Yahweh. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought. And be sure to check out these videos that YouTube seems to think you'll like. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.